just want to open it up for any announcements, or I know there's some job openings, and then we wanted to get a little bit from our sponsors, Omni, thanks to them, and then we'll take a quick break, get some pizza and soda and stuff, and then hear about data grids in Angular from Alex. So first things first, let's open it up. Announcements. Who's got something to talk about? Or you mentioned job openings.
I work for a research center in the university, and we're currently looking for a full stack developer. We do anything from e-commerce stores to games for students to learn, which is UI heavy, and it's a really great place to work. Flexible hours, awesome benefits. So if you're interested, come talk to me.
Is this DeWitt?
It is not DeWitt.
Oh.
We are an education research center within the School of Education.
I'll make another announcement about, I'm from Bulbasync. We do software for agriculture, mostly dairy, but looking for build relationships with some freelancers. We don't have a big programming staff, but as we have projects, just looking to get to know some people. So if that's you, come find me afterwards.
All right. Anyone else have any more job openings, or is there anyone got some cool project they're working on, or a little startup idea they want people to check out? Okay. All right. Well, then I think next let's hear from Omni, and then we'll take a short break.
I'll talk quick so we can eat pizza. I'm Jackie Falk, and I work for Omni Resources, so thanks for letting us sponsor the group again. We always like doing this. We did it it was in the winter, maybe 6 months or so. I remember it was snowy and cold when we did it. So, but a few things have changed at Omni since then, so we wanted to come back and kind of reintroduce ourselves to all of you. For the last 30 plus years, Omni Resources has really worked hard to create a name for ourselves in the IT staffing industry. So a company would call up and say, hey, I have a project and I don't have enough staff. Can you get me a Java developer, for example? And so we'd put someone into that client for the life of that project. About 7 years ago, we've also started to create an internal team of technologists. So developers and engineers, project managers, business analysts, QA folks, business intelligence. And this has been in addition to the continuing with our staff IT roles for contractors. So here a company would say, I need this software developed, and they put it out to bid, and we do things like that. In December of 2009, December 31st, 2009, our original owners of the company, a husband and wife team, retired. And what they did at that time was to have Omni become the only 100% employee-owned IT company in the state of Wisconsin. So we became what's commonly called an ESOP, an employee stock ownership plan. So with that, everybody that works for us becomes a part owner of the company on the day they start to work, and will earn stock in the company each year. The one thing that we've learned since we became an ESOP is that the contract consulting field doesn't mesh well with our ESOP. Your stock value grows with tenure as the stock of the company increases, as the stock shares you own increase. So if we brought that Java developer in for 6 months to do that project at ABC company, we hoped like heck when that finished, we'd have another project to put that person on. But depending on what the market was, it didn't always happen that way. So beginning early this year, we've made a switch from the traditional contract consulting business, and we're now focusing all of our hiring efforts on full-time direct placement roles working for Omni. So we're looking for the really top developers, project managers, for example. We find someone that's really good, that meshes well with our culture, we'll hire them regardless if we've got something for them to do that's billable right away. In 20 years ago, it was called hiring to the bench and having bench available in between projects. And so that's a model that we've gone back to. So our goal is to hire the best and the brightest and to continue to offer top quality IT solutions to our clients. We've got an office in Madison. We're out on the east side near American Family. We've got a Milwaukee office that's in Wauwatosa, right across from Mayfair Mall. And we've got an office in Appleton that's across from the Fox Valley Mall. So the people that work for us can work out of any of those 3 locations. Doesn't matter. We've got about 60 plus on our team right now. Sometimes they're working on an individual basis on a project for a client of ours. Sometimes they're working as part of a team, a very virtual team. The ESOP buyout means that as employees of Omni, we receive stock in the company as part of our employment. So you can't purchase the stock, and there's no majority stockholder. A lot of ESOPs, the original owners will hold on to 50 or 60 or 70%, and the remainder part they'll have out into stock of the company. In Omni, we all are equal shareholders in that. So our dedication goes farther than just merely a job. The stock benefit's a terrific additional recruitment or retirement plan. However, it's not the only tangible and immediate thing that you see at Omni. It's created really a different culture that we're pretty proud of. I get to work with an amazing, brilliant, creative team, and everybody's got in their mind the success of Omni, which is pretty cool. It's fun to be part of a driven team. We're dedicated to providing a solid work-life balance for our team. In late last year, 2004, we did an employee survey. And as part of that, our team noted that we were rated exceptional, 98% approval in the work-life balance category. So that includes, flexing your hours as you need. Maybe you need to go to a soccer game, or maybe you need to go to a users group meeting. Maybe you need to work from home for a day or so because you've got a contractor coming in. So that's something that's very well received. So that's about it. I know you may not be looking for a career change today, but we all know that can happen at a drop of a hat. Companies are bought, companies are sold. You get a new boss. You're assigned to a new technology project that doesn't maximize your skills. You get bored. You just wonder if the grass is greener somewhere else. At some point, we all have that. I'd be honored to schedule time to talk to any of you about Omni, about our ESOP, and see if we have any positions for you, if I can help you out in any other way. I put folders on everybody's chairs. Has a little bit of information about careers with Omni. They've got a variety of case studies of projects that we've done in there, and my business card. So, questions? Pizza time then, right?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for sponsoring.
Just this presentation basically, and you can click on some links to some different examples that I have of live code. Otherwise, you can just check it out at home or whatever. But yeah, github.com/AEHarding, and you can find the repository there too. So, is that on there? Just wait a second.
It's on.
Alright.
I may have to interrupt you every half an hour,
Oh, fine.
just because we run out of disk space.
That's cool.
Got it.
Good, cool. Alright. So I'm hoping to get a little bit more in depth than usual today. I know a lot of these talks are more general, but hopefully you have a good knowledge of Angular coming to this meetup. Otherwise you might be a little confused. But feel free to ask questions since there's not a crazy amount of people here. But anyway, so I'm on crutches because, I do mountaineering, I do unicycling, I ski, I skydive, and I scuba dive. Yet I fell down some stairs at the Capitol and managed to bang up my leg, or my ankle. Kind of ridiculous. Anyway, so this talk it's not really about consuming or building a data grid. I'm going to assume that you've done that before, or you kind of know, like, generally, how to get pagination working remotely or locally, stuff like that. It's also not strictly Angular, and it's not strictly data grids. So a lot of this stuff that I'm going to be telling you is more general, and I pick on data grids because they're really easy to pick on, because a lot of them are not implemented well, in my opinion. But I'll show you why I think that. So it's just Angular data grids are a good example to pick on. Also, I'm biased, so I use Smart Table 1.x in my day job, developing QE. I gave a talk with one of my coworkers a while back, but it took a while to get to actually using Smart Table, which is a data grid, in this web component framework that is built on Angular and basically gives other teams within Dell reusable UI components, anything from a button to a data grid. So, we started off with some other solutions to data grids, and they didn't really work for us, but essentially, like, here's one of the issues that we got. And so basically this guy wanted more control over data grids. And so he was asking, well, I want to customize a row template, which is completely, understandable. And he wants to, be able to bring his own search input toolbars, stuff like that, in order to kind of customize the data grid to be his own. Again, completely understandable, but at the current time, our data grid was very opinionated, and it didn't allow for that. So a lot of this stuff we could have implemented, and we could have improved our current solution, or we could kind of replace it, kind of tear off the Band-Aid and replace it with a different solution. And what we have now with Smart Table actually covers all of these points without us actually implementing them. So I'll show that in a bit. Here's another one. So this guy wanted, when there was a 401 unauthorized request in pagination or whatever, getting remote data for the data grid, he wanted to do something on that, and our other solution didn't allow that. So now actually getting more into code. So all you guys probably know directives. There's a couple different ways you can implement them. So you can use an element form, an attribute form, a class form, a comment form. Although the last two I don't really consider at all. I don't think you should ever use them because they're a little bit silly. But element and attribute both have their pros and cons from my standpoint. So elements are kind of nice because they're web component-y. So web components are going to have this custom element section in them just for that. It's a little less obfuscated, so if you use an attribute, you have to have this wrapping div or span or something like that, which adds more characters to your HTML. It also has transclusion, so you can take the contents of your implemented directive and put that in different places in your template, which you guys probably know. Cons, you can't use it with native HTML elements, so you can't put a directive in element form on a span or a div, obviously. Take it as a pro or a con. You also can't have multiple directive elements on the same element. So just like you can't have a div span. It's not possible. Attributes are nice because they have value, which is just inherent of attributes. You can have multiple directives on a single element, although that can lead to some fun scoping issues. You have multiple isolated scopes looking for the same element. And there's more that I'm going to get into. It also is a little bit more obfuscated because, of course, you have to have the div or the span or whatever to host this attribute. So going more into transclusion, here's a really simple example. So all of this I'm going to build on more, but basically it's a button. And I have this template, which just has a button element in it. And I console log to say it worked. So I'm going to show that really quickly just to show I'm not lying. But also this is on Plunker, but I'm not using Plunker because when I tried to use it an hour ago it didn't work. So I exported everything, and now I'm just going to do it locally. But let me see if I can get Sublime up here too. So again, the use case, basically you just have this MyWicked button. It has a flag icon and it says boom. Pretty simple. So it works great for a button, but that's 99% of the examples that you're going to find online for how to create an Angular directive is here's how you create a button, or here's how you create a tab set, or something really simple that doesn't take into account something like a data grid or a wizard or something that requires multiple states, and it's more complicated than stuff you see out there. So what about more complex stuff? And one example that I have is, what if you have a button that has a hint or a tooltip on it, and it also has this transcluded content as well. So if I bring up that example, and what's important to note here on this example is that the hint contents is in the attribute as a text, as a string of text. So here it works. Like when I hover over it, it shows a hint. This is based on top of drop.js, which has tether.js. It's basically a tooltip library that I'm using for this example. But you know, it's the exact same use case that I have. This kind of breaks down when you want to do more complex stuff. For example, what if you want to put that font awesome flag in the hint or the tooltip? And well, you can do this. It's really shitty, so you should never do this. But just to show you, it does work. So I can go to this third example, and I do get the flag icon. And you know, just to show you again, this is actually, you know, it's valid, it works, but you shouldn't do that because you might as well be just writing strings in raw JavaScript and appending them to the page as people were doing 20 years ago or whatever. So, another option, potentially, is you could have this hint dash icon. So maybe you have a hint directive that looks for a hint dash icon attribute, and it'll take that and basically append it to your hint or your tooltip or whatever. So in this case, you can customize it. You can have it as a flag or whatever. The problem with this is, what if you want to append it somewhere, or append it or prepend it, or what if, for example, you want to use a badge instead or something like that. So this is really inflexible, and it just covers one use case. So if you have a customer or someone that wants to use a badge inside of a hint, you're going to have to implement that yourself, and you're going to waste a lot of dev cycles to do that. So again, this works. It's just not ideal. We're not there yet. And I'm just going to show you this one again. Any questions so far? Just about these different ideas of how to do this in Angular. Alright, cool.
Is there any consideration of the number of watches? Like if this is intended to be used for a data game where you have like just months and months of these, is there any comparison of the cost of each one of these?
That's a really good question. Mostly I'm using this as a more simple example of the data grid examples, which I get to. Well, I think you should save that question for later is what I'm trying to say.
Okay.
But it's a valid question. Yeah, and it's something that I'm looking into more, but a lot of this is just trying to get the semantics from someone that's implementing these directives. So just trying to get it as flexible as possible that uses, or I hate this word, but leverages the fact that Angular gives you this dynamic HTML to work with. That you know, you don't have to use JavaScript for everything. But I'll get to that. Let's hold up. All right. So you could do it this way. You could have a hint dash icon flag, but it's inflexible. So enter multi-transclusion. This has been an issue on Angular for 2+ years. I actually implemented it in one of our projects, but it's kind of like trying to find a solution to the problem without looking at what the problem is from a more broad perspective and trying to approach it from a different angle. This will make more sense in a second. But let me show you the example really quickly. So instead of doing it how we did it before, we now have our MyWicked button. Can you guys see this?
Yep.
Cool. We have this MyWicked button, and we have this tooltip area. So this hint area where we can transclude anything that we want to put there. So maybe we want to put a badge there, maybe we want to put an icon there, maybe we want to put another button inside of the hints. I don't know what you would want to do that for, but you could. Also, we have the main content area. So there are some problems with this that I don't really like, but again, I'll just show you really quickly. If I load this up, it works great. And the implementation is a little bit interesting. Instead of using ng transclude as the attribute or element, I guess, in your directive, partial, we use this ng multi-transclude, and we say what the area is going to be called when it's implemented. I'll leave that up. But, oh, is this right? No, I'm in the wrong one, sorry. Anyway, so ng multi-transclude, it's kind of interesting. It allows you to put stuff in multiple areas, but it doesn't really solve the problem at hand. So, I did this and I was kind of like, whoa, okay, I need to step back. I'm getting really into the depths of Angular. I'm hacking away at $transclude. There's got to be a better way. So, a less going against the ways of Angular. Because if there's this open bug on an Angular project for 2+ years and people keep pinging them, like it's open, like there was a comment like 6 days ago or something, then that means that the Angular team doesn't think that it's important. So why don't they think it's important if I'm blocked? And the answer is because there's a different way to approach it. So again, here is the multi-transclusion way to do it. You have this div, name, hint, and Angular is going to take all this content and put it in my template in a specific place. Versus, maybe I have a MyWicked button. I don't know why I made an attribute. It definitely could be just an element as well. But you have your MyWicked button, you have the main content area here, and then you have your MyWicked hint as an element or an attribute or whatever, just as a directive that will then require the controller of the MyWicked button directive, and will then basically say, okay, well, whenever you're hovering over the button, take all my content and display it as a hint. So I'm going to show you that. So basically, we're going to do this Angular require thing. I'll show this really quickly. Looks like we're going to get some cool weather. So again, here's the implementation that I showed you on the slide. And then over here, it's kind of an interesting way to do it. I was trying to get it working with Angular. But we require the MyWicked button. And then down here, we have that controller. We can get the element off of it, which we add in the MyWicked button here. I don't know if that's a good practice, but that's what I chose to do. And then you can set the content to be MyWicked hints, elements, content. So it's a different way to do it, but it works exactly the same. And now you're not hacking away at Angular, but you're kind of going with what Angular wants you to do, which is require any parent controllers. So now you're getting into the context of directives and how they play out. So you'll see the same pattern when you use tabs and tab sets. All the tabs require the tab set controller, but I'm just applying it here. So the idea is to incrementally add these attribute directives as needed. So before with this is kind of monolithic because in order to add this hint icon, you have to modify the hint directive or whatever. You have to have that source. So if you're pulling in a third-party component called hint or whatever, or directive called hint, you have to modify the source of that in order to add hint dash badge or whatever something that you're going to be using in the future. But if you do it this way, you can have my wicked badge or whatever, and then you just require the controller, which might be documented somewhere, get the element and do something with it. So it's a little bit more modular. Also, I mean, it's completely separate just in terms of Angular. Since this is a completely separate directive, you can include it or not include it, so you don't have to bring the whole kitchen sink. So that's just what I talked about. Again, at Cons, it's a little less magic. So you might be thinking, well, duh, or you might be thinking you're stupid. I don't know. But I don't know. Some Angular devs didn't really get the memo. So Polymer, I really like Polymer. This is kind of a side note. It's well designed, thought out for usability, but it has very strict styling rules, and they don't have any advising towards what to do if you want to customize it for your own application. So then you end up with all these Polymer applications that look exactly the same, and it's kind of a usability problem because you don't know which application is which. So you need a little bit of your own look and feel or whatever. And it all boils down to this idea of configuration versus declaration, which I see in pretty much every data grid. It's reproducible, and I'll explain both. So the idea of configuration, if I had this my alerts directive that showed a lot of alerts in a list or whatever, configuration says you basically have a JavaScript object or whatever that is going to contain your configuration for all those alerts. In this case, it's an array of objects that contains like type danger, which is going to make it red, and stuff like that. The problem with this is it's not really extendable, since you have this one directive that's controlling all of that configuration. If you want to add some other property or something, you'd have to modify that directive. Unless it had some really cool controller with a documented API or something. But that could be a lot of work when it's not worth it. So
There are grids that have that.
there are grids that have that. Yeah, I will talk about that. Yes. So, here's that example that I have. I'm going to load it up here. So basically, this is the use case. You have my alerts, val, alerts array, or whatever. I don't know why I chose val for the name. Don't criticize me on that. But from an implementation, it's completely hidden, or the implementation is completely hidden. So if you wanted to remove the dismiss button, you couldn't do it unless there is a feature in this directive to do that. The idea of declaration, I'm really excited for this one.
This is just the tiny dot, the big dots, and it comes.
Oh, awesome. All right. So the idea of declaration is to pull out the HTML that you took for your directive and put it into the hands of the user. And the reason you do that is because then if the user wants to add an icon or something for this alert, they just add it right here because they have access to the template of your directive or whatever. But it's just Angular, and this is very readable. You can put that in a partial or whatever. It's cool. But so then if someone wants to modify this to add their own extra feature, they can do that, and they don't have to ping you and bother you. And so then you don't end up with a billion features, each for a billion users. So if that makes any sense. Again, and in this use case, I have the exact same alerts array. I'm just now putting this declarative HTML, Angular calls it, so that you can modify that as the consumer of whatever this is. And maybe you want to have like some directive that does a very kind of atomic thing. The Unix ideology that you should make each command do one thing and do one thing well, but not to have these huge directives that do everything. So then you can pull out a directive if you don't want to use it, or something like that. So now let's actually talk about data grids after we got past all that. So let's look at the usage first, how you would consume it, and then let's look at the source of the data grids. So ng-grid is a popular one. It's outdated now, and it requires jQuery. But here's the use case for it. Can anyone tell me if this is more configuration or declarative style from what I think?
ng-grid, I would say use configurations.
Yeah, configuration. Yeah, and so basically the reason for that is you have this grid option, which is JavaScript. It's just a JavaScript object. So my question is, why isn't this just some random project that doesn't really matter that it's based on Angular? Because it doesn't matter for you. This might as well just be jQuery, and you just select the object, and you pass it some JSON configuration, and it works, except for maybe the data binding of the object. But it's not using any of HTML declarative nature that Angular provides. If that makes sense. Also, if you go to the API documentation, it gets a little bit crazy. So the grid options are all of this. Like, I cannot read that. That's ridiculous. I'd have to look at that every single time. And some of these are extremely specific, like jQuery UI draggable. So I'm gonna show a bit more. Did I just close it? Oh my God. Seriously? All right, so that's ng-grid. Remote paging is it's you can do it with ng-grid, but I don't know if you guys are interested in seeing that example. All right. So UI grid, it's actually ng-grid version 2, so it's the exact same kind of implementation, but with breaking changes. So the UI team is deciding to call it UI grid. And you can go over here and see it. It's in beta, so it's not actually released yet. But it's that exact same idea. No remote data for some odd reason. You can refresh the data of the grid, but I think it's assuming on the idea of you can load 50,000 rows at a time, so you don't really need remote pagination for some reason.
There is remote pagination in UID.
All right. Not that I could find in 15 minutes, so I'm going to assume there's not.
All right.
But that's fair.
I haven't actually used it because we started out with it and it handles 60,000 rows great.
Yeah. Yeah, no, pagination locally, but not for remote data. So when you load another page, I don't think it'll make another query to the server with an offset and a limit for that new page. But it does do pagination. Also, Smart Table 0.2.x. It's outdated. It's a pretty small project. Not to be confused with Smart Table 1.x, which is a completely separate project. I have no idea why they chose to keep it under the same name, but they did, and it's really confusing. However, it is the exact same idea, where you're going to have this object that's going to define everything. In this case, you have a row configuration, and you also have a column configuration. So it's not really Angular. Maybe the developers behind the grids are using Angular, but that's not important to you as someone that's using the grid. So here's some picture of sand if I just completely bashed in what you're using or whatever. But I actually, I went through this 3 times, and it finally took me, this 3rd time to realize this. So I've been there. So ng table, it's kind of cool. I actually discovered it a couple of days ago when I was preparing for this presentation. I don't know if it just popped up or if I missed it 6 months ago, or if they completely changed. But we're finally getting to this idea of a declarative HTML data grid. So in this case, we have a native table element, and we kind of augment it with this ngTable Angular directive. So you in this case, you have table params or something like that, and you actually use ngRepeat over $data. So ngTable gives you this $data that it does something with, and then this is all Angular. So this is stuff that you know and you work with every day. Nothing too crazy. However, it does do this weird thing with the headers. So you see it starts with table body. It doesn't have the table head with the column headers. And that's controlled by it. So in that way, it's kind of configuration based because it's keeping that those table headers behind the directives. So if you wanted to add a class to the table headers, you couldn't do that unless there was some function to call or some object key to include in your configuration for the column to add a class or something like that. So Smart Table 1.x is what we're using right now. So now we're getting to the point where we have a table, native table element. We use STTable, which basically manages the controller for the table. So all child directives require this STTable controller that this provides, and then it can do manipulations, whether that's pagination or sorting or filtering or something like that. It's all done through this controller, which has this public API. So now in this case, we actually can repeat over our row collection. And so it turns out that this works really well for remote data and local data at the same time. So whether you're paging over remote data, and each time you load a new page, you're loading new data, or if you load all your data and you page, but you're paging over your local data. And I can show that more in a sec. But I can show this. So Smart Table, they don't have the best documentation website, but the nice thing about their code too is you can read over it in a pretty quick amount of time, like probably less than an hour, which is really saying something compared to most of the projects out there. So if I go into source, you can see like a STTable, which is usually like, controls everything. All it is here is the controller. So the actual directive STTable is a few lines long. It doesn't actually do much. It's just kind of the glue for all these other components. So then you have the pagination, which again doesn't really do much. You can read it pretty easily. And it so happens that this also works for remote and local data. So it's magic right now, but hopefully I'll be able to explain it better in a second here. So while you can look at how you would use it, or how you'd use that data grid, it's also interesting to see the source. So do you want me to stop for a second? All right, cool. So in terms of looking at the source, we can look at ngGrid. So if we go back, that was the grid that was kind of outdated, but it was popular a while ago, and it's configuration based. If I want to look through pagination.js to see how it works, it's a little bit crazy. I like how it seems like it's extendable because it has this API and it's registering things from it, but it's a little bit much for me. And they're having these directives which are hidden to you. So they're using Angular behind the scenes, but you can't leverage that. I hate that word. You can't leverage it because you can't use it. They're using it internally, so they're using it for their own ease of development, but you can't extend that, if that makes any sense. You can't use it yourself. At least not that's well documented. Maybe you could rebuild from scratch with their directives. But, anyway, so let me see. What's next? ngTable. So ng table is that one that's kind of like a configuration, but it's also this declarative type of syntax where they basically manage the headers of the table for you, but you put in the rest. I can go back to that if it'll remind you. So ng table, we don't have the headers for the table, but we repeat over the body ourselves. My major problem with it is now you have this header.html file that they're using directly, and if you wanted to add a class to the th of the table, you can't really do that because it's all managed by them, so you can't control it. If there's any breaking changes that you try to hack away, or if there's any changes in a future version when you were trying to hack and able to get to this th to do something, that might break. So you can't really rely on that because it's all hidden. It's this black box. So also smart table ST pagination, which I went over a little bit ago. That was cool. All right. So smart table ST pagination, again, pretty simple to look through at the source. But now I just really quickly want to show you guys what I've done with smart table. So going to the website, you guys can look over this on your own time too, but they have this interesting idea of this ST safe source. So what they'll actually do is you provide the data, or if it's local data, so we're just going to talk about local data. You provide the data, and they will copy that. They'll copy the reference of the array, not a deep copy or anything, but they'll copy it so then they can change the order and stuff like that. But they'll keep watching your array or whatever for any changes. So then they can manipulate that, do some sorting, do some filtering or whatever, but they have the original array, which they don't touch, which you provide it in terms of rows and stuff like that, basically data for the table. Templating is extremely easy because it's just Angular. So you can just do an ng include or whatever that you normally are used to. You don't have to use a JavaScript object configuration to say cell template is whatever for this row. You just use ng-include on the HTML in a declarative way. Sorting data, again, you have this st sort directive which you place on the table headers, and that will allow you to do this idea of sorting. Searching and filtering is pretty much the same way. Again, so they have this st search directive, and maybe you don't want to use st search, maybe you want to use your own search directive, and the nice thing about this is then you can do that. You can use the parts that you want. Maybe you don't want st search and you want a more complicated searching method. You just write your own directive and put it in place of it, and it'll work because you just use the API, which will basically require the st table controller, and that that controller is documented. So you can just basically take the table state and manipulate it as you want to. They have examples of selecting data rows. Again, you can use their selection that they provide, or you can build your own. Maybe you want to track by an ID or track by something that's more interesting when you're paging over data, and then you can implement it yourself. So you can use what they provide, which makes it simple, but then you can build off of it. You're not stuck in a hole when you need to do more complex things with your tables. So they talk about client-side pagination versus, remote data pagination. They have this idea of a pipe or an AJAX plugin. So everything's a plugin essentially in Smart Table, but you can intercept the request. So you say you want it to call server, and then you return the data, assuming that you accept the table state. So the table state will say I'm on page blah, and then you can interpret that to say, okay, well, I want to make a call to the server with offset equals 100, limit equals 10, stuff like that. and then you would return that data through a promise or something. Yeah, and the nice thing, again, is you can create your own plugin because it's just a directive. So here they show multi-selecting, and that's not in the source of a smart table, but it's something that someone built themselves. So draggable headers, it's kind of a cool example. Again, not in the source, but they just provide this as an example because they assume that a lot of people will use it. Pagination on scroll, this idea of infinite scrolling, you can implement not with the source, but just by creating your own directive. Fixed headers works as well. That's just pure CSS and Flexbox. And then custom pagination. I actually created a pull request and included this example because I noticed someone was interested in it. And since I was kind of in the smart table world already, I figured I might as well do it for my own practice. So they wanted the way to type in a text box to get to any arbitrary page or go to first, last, or page through them. And I created that. But again, there's no modification to the source. It's just adding this example to the documentation. Yeah. So that's that. I really quickly want to show you what we're working on at where I work. So when we transferred over to start to use Smart Table, the only questions that we really got were, how do we do this? And the nice thing is, if someone's asking you, how do you implement X feature like infinite scrolling, you can just point them to it, or you can create a plunker example, since it's not creating a pull request to your source to add this feature, or saying, go to this third-party component because I can't modify the source, because I consume it. So it's much better to say, okay, I'll take 2 seconds and create a plunker example for you. And there's nothing you really can't do because it's not the kitchen sink. It's not a black box. So here we just have some examples. We're wrapping Smart Table, so we have our own styles for it. But basically we just have a whole lot of different examples, and people can click Edit in Plunker and see how it works themselves. But we have a separate directive for this idea of selecting multiple rows. This isn't implemented in Smart Table, it's a completely separate thing. Pagination with remote data. So that load icon that you saw there is actually our own thing, but it's kind of cool that you can just add it immediately. And this is, again, actually creating the requests. So you can go to network, and we can see the JSON being loaded with a limit and an offset, which we define in our app.js. So we can actually have this call server, which is this idea of a pipe, which takes the table state and it'll do stuff. So it'll basically say, here's the params. In this example, I say, here's the params that I'm going to include in my request, and here's how I calculate them. So in one example, Smart Table is saying the table state is I'm on this page, and then you take it and you're like, okay, well, I need to create a request saying I want this offset. So you can manipulate it as much as you want. In fact, it doesn't really have to even be JSON. It could be XML or something. You could parse it yourself. So it doesn't really matter. So the idea of a pipe is a little bit powerful. Here's something that's kind of cool that you can't really do with any other tables. The idea of expanding rows. So you can just expand any row. And it's not something in Smart Table, it's just something that I built to consume it. And this is, while this is in a private project, I actually have this on my public GitHub page if you're kind of interested in how this works. But it's fun to get working. So.
Can you show us that page?
Yeah, sure. I can post it online too, but let me just go to it really quickly. And I, again, was tinkering with it at the time that I built it, so let's see if I can find it. There's so many projects. Here it is. ST row detail. So I actually have a live example but it's the exact same thing. Just so now you have this idea of
Very
click a
nice.
row and then press some buttons or do whatever you want. And the cool thing about this, the animation is actually much harder than you'd think it would be to implement, since tables are very opinionated and you can only have a table header, table rows in very specific places, or else even Chrome won't allow you to do it. But yeah, so fun to get working, but it's just something that one of our customers wanted that no other table or data grid could provide, unless we hacked away at it. But now we don't have to hack away, we just provide a new example. So yeah, I guess the takeaway is, just because it claims to use Angular, which maybe it does, doesn't mean that it really helps you. So if you're just having this JavaScript configuration, you could do that anywhere. You could do that in jQuery. But if you actually have the ability to write the declarative HTML, you have a lot more power. And if you're writing this reusable UI component library, it takes away a lot of headache, because you're not wasting dev cycles implementing each little nitpicky thing that only one customer wants, and then bloats everyone else's software, but they just write their own little part. So yeah, anyway. Also, Docker rocks, and that's what my latest craze is. So kind of cool stuff. If you want to talk to me about that, I'd love to talk to you. So yeah, that's all I got.
Since we have time, do you mind telling us why Docker rocks? I mean, tell us a little bit what you've been doing with it.
Sure.
Compare notes.
Yeah, so I can totally show you. Basically, before we had this, we were using Heroku, and we were also using OpenShift, but no one really likes OpenShift, especially for Node.js projects, because they only allow you to use a certain version. Or actually, if you install NPM packages, it will break, because the version of NPM is like 1 billion years old, so you can't actually install packages. So OpenShift is broken. However, OpenShift v3 or vNext, whatever it's going to be, is actually going to be based on top of Docker. So it's going to be a lot better than it is now. I only mention that because Dell kind of is invested in OpenShift. But anyway, so Docker is really cool. If you've ever heard of Tudum, kind of neat place.
$5.
What's that?
$5 a server. Oh,
But what do you mean?
is that the pricing we have?
Oh, it's free.
Oh, it's free.
Yeah, so if you create an account now, it'll be free forever, and they'll never charge you. But basically, it allows you to manage Docker servers. So if I can explain the architecture, I have a whole lot of Node.js instances, and they all have different parts of the site that I run, and they're all proxied through Nginx, which has some authentication stuff or whatever. So you can actually go to c.software.dell.com/cx/q and see our code. You have to be authenticated, but Nginx does all that. The cool thing with Docker is, before we were kind of hacking away at Heroku with the free instances and basically spinning up an instance of our Node.js server for each thing. So then we had these talk to each other, and it was really hacky. But now we just have a container for each Node.js instance and the last Nginx instance, and also our database. And they're completely separate, and we can stop them whenever we want. And the really nice thing is we can do it all on our local server, or our development environment. So I can log in. This is really cool. Anyway, if I can remember my login information. Also, what was kind of blew my mind when I first started working on this is I started all this. I had like 11 servers or whatever running on DigitalOcean, and then I was told, okay, well, why don't we do it on Azure, because Azure has Linux support or whatever. So I typed in my Azure credentials here. I deleted my DigitalOcean credentials, and magically, without me doing anything, all of those Docker containers migrated over to Azure. Kind of cool. So I didn't even tell it to do anything. and it saw, okay, here's an open machine. I'm going to put those containers, since they're completely isolated, doesn't really matter where they are, onto that other server. So here you can see, here's all these different machines I have running, and they're all linked together. There's some nice things with Docker, like Docker Compose, if you ever heard of it. So then you can do Docker Compose up, and it'll start all your servers, open the correct ports and links to each other, so that it can run. But for example, for this stack, you can have the Docker Compose. I don't know why it's partially running. Actually, should check that. But you have this idea of a stack file. So you push the images when you create your machine. It'll compile the image or whatever, push it to Tudum, and then Tudum will take that image and deploy the instance of it wherever. And you can scale it, so you can have like 5 instances of that specific image that you created for that container.
So they don't host the containers themselves. You tell them where you want.
Yeah, you tell them. They actually host the image. So they host not the thing that is instantiated, but just the image for that container, which can be like 500 megabytes. So it's actually kind of cool that they just host it. But I like to think about the images as kind of like Git versioning for instances. So anyway, they host that, and then they basically run that Docker image on whatever provider you choose. You can actually bring your own. You can run a curl command and execute a script on any Ubuntu, CentOS server, or whatever, and it'll automatically connect it to Tudum to be managed, which is kind of neat. But again, so here we just make specific links to specific ports. This is the Nginx C router, and then each of these Node.js instances can be running on port 80. But since they're separate, isolate containers, there's no conflicts, and they just the Nginx router is able to see these as separate machines or whatever because they have their own host names, each running on port 80. So I'm not going to talk too long about that. But.
Any configuration.
Yeah, so even a web developer can do it really easily, like in 2 days or something like that. I got it up and running with from nothing. So really neat. And Tudum makes it really easy. There's other neat projects coming up. One of the hard things to do with Docker, the non-trivial tasks, is, from what my perspective is backing up your databases. Because before you could just, go to your Rock Mongo manager or whatever, and then back it up. Or maybe you were using some hosted database service, and then they would do automated backups, but it's a little bit harder with this. But anyway.
What are the Docker tools you've used? You said Composer, and what else is popular?
Docker Compose is actually in Docker, but
it's part of Docker.
I think, it used to be called Big. It's called Docker Compose. Also boot to Docker, but that's just pretty much by default. So you actually run boot to Docker, which runs Docker inside of a VM, which then runs Docker containers inside of that. So got some crazy VM shit happening all over the place.
Boot to Docker is for development, though, not for server. Correct?
Yeah, exactly. So in production, you'll be running Docker directly.
Docker daemon.
Yeah, because you'll be running Unix on your server. Also, Microsoft is doing some interesting stuff with this. So right now, it's all based on the Unix kernel or whatever. I don't know. I'm a web developer. But in the future, you'll be able to create containers that are based off of Windows or some flavor of it, PowerShell and stuff. Don't take my word for it. Again, I'm a web developer.
Disclaimer.
I've got some questions going back to your grid. So first of all, I'm pretty heavily invested in UI grid, but I really like your declarative style. That's definitely, you're right on. That's the shortcoming of the grid solutions. I was just wondering, have you been able to sort of virtualize the data in such a way that you can handle tens of thousands of rows, or is that just sort of something you've had to sacrifice and you just go with pagination?
Yeah, so almost all of our customers, we actually haven't had a complaint with this, but they all have remote data, and they will paginate it remotely. So at any time, we'll only have like 50 rows on our server.
On the client, you mean?
Sorry, on the client, yeah. But that's something that would be cool to look at more. So it's not something that's a big concern just because that's not something that we do. But yeah, I mean, it's valid, definitely. I'd actually like to look at it a bit. But I could imagine it would be too hard to do. Again, this is just like the idea of what someone implementing or consuming a data grid would like to see, just because then they could extend it in various ways. But in terms of making it fast, I feel like that's something that could be engineered, not
You actually have to
From
remove
the
the
style.
DOM nodes when you're dealing with that many rows, or just because the browser can't handle that 60,000 rows. So you get 60,000 rows and 25 columns. You've got to actually remove the nodes that aren't in view. And I conceptually, I'm not seeing how you would do that with that type of setup, but maybe there's a way that you can. Maybe something other than ng repeat.
Well, ng repeat.
Well, I guess
I don't believe it
you'd have
actually
to-
has them rendered. I think it only renders whatever is repeated, which in this case, if you're paginating over local data, you'd have the local data, but it wouldn't render them. And it wouldn't be hidden, it would actually be
It actually removes.
detached from the DOM. But again, I can't say that for sure, since I haven't looked at that too much. But I couldn't imagine it would be an issue. Or if it would, create your own ng repeat. Because you don't have to use it, which is nice. Although ng repeat, if you've looked at the source, it's pretty crazy. It uses some regex foo.
So your favorite is that ST table,
Smart
the
table.
smart table?
Yeah.
That's the 1.0 or the 0.1.0?
1.0. So the latest version, essentially. Again, I like it, but not only that, we're using it in production, and we haven't gotten any complaints from the different projects that are using it. Again, the most that we get is, how do I do X, just because they don't know Angular that well. And the answer is, here's a Plunker example of doing that.
What about, Barry had a question earlier about watches. Have you compared the watches that are generated with the different grids? That really we've run into problems with scrolling on having too many watches.
Right.
That's just something that really, I mean, in the core, there's nothing there, so it's just whatever you put in your directives, you pass that problem off to the consumer.
No. So that's actually, if the nice thing about Smart Table is it takes all the stuff that's trivial and abstracts that, but you can do as much as you want. So you can replace as much as you want. So if this makes any sense, if performance was a concern, you could probably create some type of a directive that would solve that. You could extend it because it's not managing your data. You just use an ng repeat. So in that case, you would just, not do I see what you're saying with watches, because interpolation isn't really the best way to do it. But you could probably just have a template for your row, which would do some one-way binding or something. It would just be compiled once. It wouldn't set up any watchers over your ng repeated rows.
Yeah,
So-
and that's basically what I think the other projects do internally, is basically do most of that one-way binding for you.
Right.
But,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, also Angular 1.3 has one-way binding in interpolation, but yeah. So that's something you would have to do yourself. But again, I haven't really encountered that as an issue from our customers that have been using it. Check that out. That's pretty cool. What's that? Yeah.
But what's Common UI? Is that a Dell specific for Dell customers or?
Yeah, the Common UI is kind of like a Dell internal thing. We're trying to open source it. Actually, right now, we used to have like all of our CSS and JS in one bundle, but we're gonna have this cux.css, which will just have our CSS in one separate project, and then QE will consume that. But we might actually be releasing that open source, just because, you know, we consume so many open source projects. It just makes sense to at least contribute back by letting people see it, tinker around. Yeah.
Is it possible to do an export with the data from the state grids?
Definitely. Yeah, totally. I think actually ng-table, the one that was kind of declarative and kind of configuration based, has an export to CSV directive. And you could just pull that off and use it with anything, because again, it's just looking at the table or whatever. So yeah, definitely. You might have to write it, you might have to look it up or find it yourself, but it's not a limitation at all. Any other questions? Cool. All right.
Thank you.